This is the school food waste and composting training. Let's dive in with Corey, the compost worm. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really excited to have you all here and see your faces. So today I think we're gonna just keep it pretty casual. I think we might go around and do some introductions really quick and then just dive in, kind of do popcorn style. I'm Olivia. I work with the Upper Valley Lake Sunapee Regional Planning Commission.
I'm Natasha Duarte. I'm the director of the Composting Association of Vermont. While most of my work is based in Vermont, I have been working on a regional project with sites in New Hampshire and Connecticut. And I do a whole lot of things in my position with the Composting Association of Vermont. But one of my favorite things and one of my larger projects is with community composting. So supporting communities and groups at all different kinds of locations. Some are schools, but also food shelves and libraries and community gardens and neighborhood corners, setting up community compost sites. I'm also the chair of Vermont Farm to Plate's Food Cycle Coalition. So within that body of work, we do a whole lot around food waste reduction and then getting edible food into the charitable food system, and then also partnering with farmers to get food to animal feed or for their compost systems, and then composting. So sort of that whole spectrum of then growing food again. And I guess I'll just say I'm really happy to be here, and thank you, Olivia, for inviting me to join your project and to hopefully add some knowledge.
Definitely glad to have you. And Natasha was my teacher when I did a UVM master composter training, and so I was really appreciated her perspective and her way of communicating. So that's how I heard about Natasha, and was really glad she was available to help communicate to you guys as well. So I think I'm going to jump in and we'll try the popcorn style and see if we're a small enough group and how that works. But does anybody have a question that's come up for them, either watching the videos or just thinking about doing any sort of food waste diversion at your school?
I can start. So Unity is back 100% full-time, like in school. But the cafeteria is closed because, it's like we can't have our classes intermingling. So the kids are currently eating lunch in the classroom. They get like little to-go containers. And then I think it's just made things like we used to have like a pig bucket where the kids would dump their extra food, and like farmers in town who had pigs would like take it for the pig slop, and kids would like leave their unused apples and oranges or whatever, unopened stuff for the other kids to just take if they wanted it. But with COVID and with kids eating in their classrooms, we can't really do that. We can't be sharing food, and we can't be doing that type of stuff. So I don't know, like I feel like this year we've gotten even worse than we were last year. So I don't know if you had any advice for that and how to kind of make it work when everyone is so isolated in their own classroom.
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you want me to, Olivia, did you want to answer that, or do you want me to jump in and then you can add? Okay.
I think you can go for it, and I'll add as I feel I can.
Sure. So, so a couple questions, I guess, back just so I'm understanding. So the share tables, that food that used to be shared, is that provided by the school?
Yes.
Those lunches? Yep. Okay. So one thing that that waste audits, share tables, compost systems, all of those, any of the, the pig buckets, all of that helps with when you're separating out what isn't being consumed or eaten in a school setting. That's a great opportunity to make observations around like, hey, half of the milk is not getting consumed, or we have an overabundance of apple, whatever it is. And I know that may vary, but if you see any trends, that is, that's really good information to get back through your administration to whoever's making those purchasing decisions. I know at some schools from the composting system level, they kept seeing like these perfectly good, untouched rolls in their coming into their compost buckets and into their compost system. And so after they really established that this was a trend, they started separating them and basically translated that back. And the school actually changed some of their purchasing decisions around what it was they were providing based on the feedback that students weren't eating it. They weren't interested in it. And it's great that it was at least being composted instead of landfilled, but it's still a waste, right? It's still perfectly edible food that's just being put in the compost. And so reducing food waste is always on that top level of the food management hierarchy. And in the end, it actually saved the school a bit of money, because then they were able to not just be basically buying stuff that's not being consumed. So that's one idea of just, I know the shared tables have been really popular and are great, and COVID has really put I understand that can't really be done right now. But I do think that that's still an opportunity to see what's left over. Have you been able to maintain the relationships with the farms for the pigs or anything else?
I don't think we don't currently do it. I assume if we, offered it, they would probably take it. It's just hard with everyone being in their own separate place. We don't just have one big bucket where they all clear at the same spot and dump their food in there.
Yeah. So, it still might be worth seeing, talking with whoever might be managing that, or whether it's facilities or, I'm not sure how your school is set up, but, even if there's a larger bin or tote that a student can be appointed, like at the end of the day, to just go and dump into it, it's really no more, there's no inherent risk with doing that, dumping those food scraps into a larger container in terms of spreading COVID. The potential touch points that the school would probably want to be cautious about is if it's a lidded tote opening, like any surface that's going to be handled by multiple people. And that could even be gotten around either by providing gloves or by having someone who's supervising open a larger tote and then just have the smaller buckets be emptied into it. So I think that there are ways to think about how to creatively sort of work around. I know it's not as easy. I don't know what your bandwidth is or what the other teachers' schools' bandwidth is, just because you guys are juggling a whole lot right now in addition to these programs. And so that's something to definitely be sensitive to, not just be like, oh, why don't you just do this extra thing when, some folks are already feeling like they're buried under all of these extra things, and it's stressful. But there are potential ways around that. And then as well, depending on what composting system you set up, you could start thinking about how, you're going to come across the same kinds of collection issues, at least for this year, and maybe next year. I mean, I don't know, right? None of us know. So what would that look like, and how could that be managed? It may also be that a farmer's totally okay with getting a bunch of small 10-gallon bins. So I think really just sort of circling back to one of my main points in all things community-based is just communicating. Asking, it might be that the farmers are like, man, I am like also juggling, or their family situation, whatever their situation is, really understanding that COVID is going on, it's impacting all of us in different ways, but still being willing to reach out if you feel like you're able to, and have those conversations and see what they're willing to. Maybe they can meet you halfway somewhere in terms of how they would require it to be able to accept it.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Thanks.
Great. Any other questions? You can type it in or you can just unmute and ask if that's easier.
I have a question.
Sure, Maureen.
If you are assuming, or if I am assuming, I should say, that we are simply recycling paper and plastic in our school setting, maybe aluminum too, and you want to add a composting section or a composting arm to that, I think that you're starting at ground zero. And in order to be successful, and I think, Kristen, I'm also talking to you about this, that in order to be successful, I think we should start small and show success in a small setting, but I'm not quite sure how that would look. I know that step 9 or 10 in the videos you gave us, there was an audit. So determining how much waste there is and setting some goals for yourself. But I mean, there was a lot of information in those videos. And I'm just wondering, what is your recommendation for where to start?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And one of the things that I love the most about community composting is there's no one right way to do it, right? The science is basically the same, regardless of scale or system. I mean, in terms of what, getting the right mix of stuff together to have things effectively compost. And then the rest is really best, communities are best served when you find a way to start a program that suits your culture and your community at the best level. I agree with you 100%. I talk a lot to groups about starting small. There's always room for expansion, but you start small, you have just a better handle on figuring out the collection system, figuring out if there's going to be issues with contamination, getting things sort of together and right. And there's always room to expand. But if you do come across any sort of systematic or composting, sort of process of composting issues, if you start small, those problems also tend to be small, which is a nice place to sort of get a toehold. In some ways, so waste audits are great, but they can be done at whole different scales. You could do a waste audit in a single classroom, just by separating out and paying more attention to it. You could do it at the school level, of course. Or at, depending on what kind of community you're talking about. We do it, I've done it with my nieces at our house when they come to visit, because I like to teach them about these things and have these conversations, and it's something interactive is just a good way to get kids engaged. And so it can be done at any scale. So don't feel like, I guess what I would first say is, don't feel like you had to go big or go home, right? Go whatever scale that you feel comfortable with tackling. In some ways, having kids eat in their classrooms gives you that smaller scale right now to sort of get your toes wet with it. And maybe you don't start school wide, maybe it's, you start in a pilot classroom or number of classrooms, depending on how big your school is, where you can start, doing the, even if you don't start with the audit, I like to engage, especially with schools and kids, the more they're engaged up front in terms of helping make signs to put over the different bins of what goes in which bin, helping them think through what would be accepted in your compost system and why. That helps them learn, and then they're much more likely when they're at the bin to know what goes in which bin. It is tricky when, when some outside group comes in and you get all this new signage, but no one in the community who's actually going to be using it was engaged in creating those signs. And then there's a little bit of disjointed, you just need more training at that point. I mean, that's fine too. But I think this is a great opportunity to get whoever is going to participate at whatever scale you think you can start at, involved in the whole process. Right? Like, why are we doing it? First, understanding the why. and then creating some signs or having, different combinations of things that go up, alternating who's going to stand by that and sort of be the waste steward and help make sure or answer questions of what goes in which bin as it goes forward. So these are all just different ideas of things that I've seen. And then just sort of figuring out how that best fits for your situation is my best advice on that. But really feel like, if one classroom in a school starts, that is just as valid way to begin as getting everyone on board at once. And maybe, especially with the layers of COVID going on, that's something to consider.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I know with our elementary school, our plan was to start just composting snack material.
Mm-hmm.
Just start small with the plastic ice cream containers
Mm-hmm.
that would go in a classroom, and then kids could compost whatever was left over from snack. So that was how we were going to start small.
Sure.
But that hasn't happened yet.
Are you in school?
We are in school. We're full in school. We do have a remote academy, but most of our kids are in school.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, 5 days a week.
Yeah. One nice thing, if you can get some kind of system up and going, is that it is an opportunity for outdoor education, which, may be especially welcome right now. But yeah, I think starting with snack time, really starting with just whatever it can be, is what I'd suggest for sure. What are other folks, where are other folks at in terms of thinking of starting sort of scale wise?
I came late, and I'm from Plainfield Elementary School. We have, we are composting currently. Well, we're not, we haven't started this year, but we're going to start maybe next week, just because we wanted to we're in school 5 days a week, but I just wanted to get started with the academic stuff, and I teach middle school. And then my 7th grade is the grade that collects all of the compost and then brings it out and puts it outside every day. So hopefully we're going to start next week, and we'll put buckets in everyone's room, and then they put it in a central one, and then my guys take my classroom and the central one out to the bin. But ours is a cold composter, I think. And so it means that we've got 2 bins right next to each other. So I don't know what's going on in the almost full bin, but I think I need to rotate it to the empty bin.
And is that the one that's almost full, is that material from last year?
Yeah, maybe year? 2 years now. It doesn't smell. It smells real good. Doesn't smell at all.
Yeah.
I don't know what it's doing though.
And what kind of bins are they?
They're like wood, tall, Olivia's been there. They're tall.
Can you take the slats off one side?
I can take the slats off in the front, and they were supposed to be able to have a tractor get in there, but I think they were a tiny bit too small. Ooh. So yeah, so that's my problem. That's the problem I'm trying to solve.
Yeah. So boy, and that's a good point that you raise. And you'd be surprised how often that happens when people build bins and then they're it's 3 inches too narrow for their bobcat to get in or something, it's just if it had just been a little bit bigger. But that's actually super common. That's one of the things that I try to talk to sites about who are just starting think the whole thing through and what equipment you might have access to or might be using, because that can make a really big difference. Do you know what the approximate dimensions are? Is it 4 by 4, 4 feet by 4 feet, or how much material are you talking about needing to move?
Yeah, I think 4x4 sounds about
Mhm.
right. I mean, the pulley system to open the top is great.
Mhm.
But I think it's like 4x4. So, and then there's a slat, and then on the inside are the individual slats. So you take out one
Mhm.
slat, and then, yeah. So
Yeah.
maybe I just need to get in there and shovel it and turn it over.
Yeah, I mean, if you can, it's, it's definitely, if it's possible, or if you feel that it's possible to move it from one bin to the next, that would be a nice way for you to just really check on the material. Is it fully decomposed? Is it, like what sort of, where is it at? What
Mhm.
is it maybe needing in terms of being finished, or is it just need time?
Mhm.
And so in terms of cold composting, it sounds like you're just basically you're just add stuff and layering, and you're not doing a whole lot of management along as it
No.
goes. So it's cold or static.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally fine if you have enough space for that in your system, for sure. Um, and yeah, and in terms of that, I mean, it would be great if you go out and you look at it and you just are like, oh man, like there's nothing wrong with letting it just sit there another year and using the new bin. Um, but one thing that does happen with cold or static systems is as you're layering it and it decomposes and you keep layering it on and it sits there, it can get really dense, like really hard packed.
Mhm.
And so having an opportunity to sort of go in and turn it and aerate it, you might get another little round of decomposition, which would need to happen to finish the actual full decomposition and stabilizing that
Mhm.
material and finish compost. And that's just because it needs a certain amount of oxygen and
Yeah.
water. And if it's really tight in there, and I'm just saying, like, a lot of cold systems do after time just sort of get denser and denser. Not having seen your system, you'd need to just check on that.
Right. I want it to be aerobic and not anaerobic.
That's right. And so with that the denser it gets, you run the risk of getting little pockets. The whole thing may be okay, but if you're digging it out, I wouldn't be surprised if you come across pockets where it's a little anaerobic in there, especially if any paper goods or leaves even have gotten in there and they kind of like plate, they like stack. And that's another place that it can get really dense and just nothing really happens in there, or at least nothing aerobic. So nothing, it might stink a little bit, but if it's been in there for a couple of years, you're probably fine. Assess it. If you find really wet pockets, you might want to add a little bit of extra carbon material of some sort just to balance that out. If it's dense but super dry, you might want to water it a little bit as you're moving it. Just trying to anticipate what you might find.
Yeah, I don't know because I
Mhm.
haven't. And
Haven't
when I
looked
go
at
to
it yet.
school, yeah, when I
Yep.
go to school, I kind of like dress up, and then I don't want to be in the mud. There's lots of
Sure.
little things. So
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
so Jen, what do you use for brown? What do you add to your food scraps?
we've been using hay actually.
Does a volunteer bring that? Is that something that a parent brings for you?
So
Or?
I do this with another teacher, and it just kind of shows up.
Oh, wow, magic.
I really
Love magic.
yeah, it's kind of like I'm like, and I looked in the one bin and I was like, wow, there's nothing in this bin. I wonder why there's nothing in there, because I knew that my kids were using both last year. It was whatever they felt like using.
Mhm.
And I looked in the one and I was like, there's nothing in there. How is there nothing in there? And then I looked in the other one and I was like, but it compacted a lot.
It compacted. Oh, okay.
So when it decomposes, you're going to lose up to 50% volume to begin with, and so that's part of right. That's just the materials breaking down.
Yeah.
But yeah, it like as you keep layering and layering, it does tend to compact. One thing I will say, as lovely as it is to have a great partner who's in a project or program that takes care of things, having a binder or having a shared file where some of these things are written down is something that you might consider, just because like as long as your compost program partner is there to sort of be taking care of these details, that's fine. But if something happened and they got sick, they had to they had a life change, like whatever it is, like if they didn't show up, you would maybe find yourself in the situation of like, this other person always took care of this. I don't even know who to call to get it.
Yeah.
And so just having some sort of shared and it doesn't need to be fancy, but, or like horribly onerous, but like just some system of communication among whoever is taking care of those details, and like contact numbers, or like, oh, I always get it from Guy's Farm and Yard down the road, and he gives it to me for free or at a discount because we're a school, or whatever those things are. It can be really helpful to have. But what you're describing is very common, I'll have to say, and that's why I'm always talking about communication, because it's really easy to just be like, this just happens and it's great. And then until it isn't, right? And then people are like, oh no. So just something to think about for this year, sort of maybe setting up just some key contacts or key procedures. Yeah.
So you have an open system, Jen. Have you ever had critters like bears?
Oh, it's not open. It's all closed.
Oh, it's closed. Okay.
It's totally closed. And the Plainfield campus is, I guess it's a campus. School is super like, there's a lot of space, and it's right it's on the edge of our parking lot.
Okay.
So.
Right.
So my 7th graders are allowed, it's like a privilege that they get to go out, they get to cross the parking lot and go and deliver the stuff. And most of the time it all ends up in there. There's a lot of responsibility that I'm allowing them to have. They get pretty excited about it because they're like, this is my time not to be supervised at all.
Yes.
And all I'm going to do is sing really loud, although not this year because we're not allowed to sing, but yeah.
Yep. Yep. And do the students add carbon or straw as they go? Okay, so you have it.
It was on our job chart last year, and so at the beginning of the year we went out and I was like, you dump it here, then you grab 3 handfuls of straw and put it on top, and then you rinse out the bin, and then you give it back to Miss Jana, and she's our custodian. And so the other really cool piece is that the custodians are on board with it, and so. I'm the one that's like, hey, I will transport it out, but they take care of most of the major collection piece. So we have always eaten in our rooms at Plainfield. So that's not changing, but the way that we get our food is a little bit different now. And so I need to kind of think about that too, because everyone's getting it in a reusable container. And so those reusable containers are put back outside our door. So I need to kind of process how that's going to work.
Yeah.
The regular snack one.
New systems.
Yeah. So, but it's part of the culture of our school to compost. And so we will do it. Because it's important for the kids to have that connection.
Yeah.
So.
Is anyone else on the call having compost systems already in place, or are the rest of you really just thinking about how to set it up?
Just starting.
Starting up.
Yeah, I had started a compost system 5 years back, and then I was told that I wasn't allowed to add any food waste to it, that I could really only add leaves or, from the gardening stuff. And then I was having volunteers putting in seeded weeds, and it was just a mess. So I actually got rid of that. And then I decided that I would vermiculture compost. And then the worms were dying because I think it was too hot in the school. And so they were drying out. And then I had them in the cafeteria, which made the most sense to me, so that kids could bring over the food waste right to the worms, and we'd have one of the school nurse actually sat over them to make sure they weren't putting anything bad into the vermiculture. But I don't think they liked all of the foot traffic. It was maybe too loud. I mean, I never did figure it out, but they just died, and it was like 4 years of worm death. And I was like, I'm done.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to try, now that I got our principal is a new principal. So when she said, she showed us this, I think I can actually have her say, yes, we can have food waste in our compost system. So
great.
Yeah. So this will be a new system for us.
So Natasha, what system do you see most frequently used by schools? I know it depends on volume, The
Yeah.
tumbler doesn't seem to be large enough.
Mhm.
And an open, the open baskets, the open bins, I don't know if that would encourage critters.
Yeah, I would not recommend that, especially around schools.
Yeah.
So what I most commonly see at schools are either a bin system,
Mm-hmm.
like 2, 3, 10 in a line, depending
Yeah.
on how big the school is, a bin system. Or, and I think I included some pictures. If not, I can pull some up. St. Albans Elementary School, through some grant, got a bunch of soil saver bins and tumblers. And so instead of the bins, they have, instead of like a wooden bin where there's a whole line of them, they have a whole line of these soil saver, the sort of like backyard compost bins, and they're just using them as bins. Well, tumblers, but also just a static bin, like a plastic, rigid plastic square kind of thing.
Yeah.
And what was interesting that they did was they actually used that as an opportunity to create compost teams among the students. And so different groups of students are in charge of different bins. So they have sort of different things going on, and there's like little competitions and who's, temperatures. And so it's
a
kind
little
of
step
interesting
project.
Yeah. And then they also tried, I know one year they had the different student groups using slightly different recipes to see so the students could learn what if effect that had on decomposition rates or on, the temperature, is this getting hot? Is this not getting hot? So they could sort of experiment with the students with different systems. And that's the only school that I've actually seen with, I think they have like, I want to say 7 of these sort of rigid plastic backyard style bins, but then they also have, I think, 5 of the large Jora insulated compost tumblers that they use as well. And so their system is just sort of a grand experiment in different systems and figuring it out. But I think most common is probably the bin system.
The bins
with the slats that the wooden bigger bins with the slats that you can take out. Charlotte Central School was given, someone donated a large Jora tumbler to them, and they tried to use that for sort of pre-digestion or pre-decomposition of their food scraps and then moving that into the bin. And they found it did not work at all for them. It really messed up their flow. Everyone was confused. The bins weren't quite big enough. It was like this big thing. And then they donated it, actually, they re-donated it to a co-housing site that is now using it, and it works great for their bin tumbler bin combination system. But so it really sort of depends, but they got it after they had their system established, I think for 5 or 6 years, and they really had it down. And so it was like, all of a sudden it was like, wait, this is this new step, and how does this work? And it's not as like, it just sort of messed things up. And so they gave up after about a month of trying it and just donated it on to another community group.
I was thinking about like the tumbler thing first and then putting it in the bins, because the pre-digestion seemed easy, or it seemed like a good thing. And then I was like, but if you're adding it every day, if you're adding compost every day, it almost seems like you need 2 or 3 tumblers.
Yeah.
More than one tumbler. A lot of tumblers have 2 chambers.
Okay.
So you're adding to one side and then you close it down, and then you can start adding to the other side. And by the time that side's full, often the first side is like, there's a little bit of art and experience that comes with managing those. So then the first side, the first chamber may have reduced by half. And so then you need to decide, do you empty it then, or do you like put more stuff on and then by then put more, and when do you empty it out? A lot of the community sites that I work with, especially residential ones that are in residential areas, like to start with the tumblers because they're up off the ground, they latch closed, it feels safer in terms of wildlife, and really if you're adding to it every day and you're adding a little bit of carbon to it, within a week, you can probably empty that first chamber into a bin system. It's not done. So you're not talking about doing the whole process in tumblers alone. It's more that you would get it going and broken down enough so a lot of that initial ick factor is gone, a lot of the odors might be gone, and then it's just less interesting potentially to other wildlife. Yeah. So but again, you would want a larger volume tumbler, and maybe two, depending on how big your school is and what volume it is you're diverting into it. Yeah.
Do you use Compost Starter?
No.
You know, that enzyme that you can? No. Okay.
Yeah.
Don't need it.
So I personally believe that a shovelful of compost, just soil, just healthy soil, or a shovelful of manure if you have that. Horse manure is great. Into any kind of system does enough. And that's really, especially, I do that when I'm starting like brand new, pristine, clean systems, especially if they're not in contact with the ground below, like if there's a bottom to it or if it's on a cement pad.
Sure.
And then after you clean it out the first time, just don't clean the whole thing out. Like we recommend a lot that you that sites use hardware cloth for open bottom bins to keep rodents out. Yep. And they're like, oh, but my pitchfork is going to get stuck in it, and how am I ever going to get all the compost out? I'm like, just leave that lower layer. That's great. That inoculates kind of the rest of the system.
It allows the worms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine to not, you don't have to get every little scrap of compost out if you're moving material, if you're either moving finished material out or if you're turning it from one bin to another. But I do have some colleagues who swear by the starter. That's just never been my philosophy. I have experimented with it. I couldn't tell any difference at all. But I wasn't doing like lab tests. I was just sort of like visually in my own experience, in my own system, what am I seeing? And I don't know, Olivia, or I see Cindy has joined. I don't know if either of you have different opinions about those compost starters or inoculants, but
I have never used a starter, and I've been composting since the 90s. I actually am testing out a green cone right now, which is something that I've never used before in my world. And if you follow those directions, as they say, it's not really doing what it should be doing. So I'm about to add the activator. So I'm doing a 3-month test on the green cone. First month was exactly by following the directions they gave me. Second month is, you know what? I'm doing my stuff that I know as a compost operator. And now third month is going to be, let's put that activator in there and see what happens. So yeah, I've never had a compost starter. And just to, follow up with what Natasha was saying is like, just leave whatever's there on the bottom. Like you just start it with a compost that's already been created. That's what you start your bin with again.
Okay, thank you.
Think of it as like sourdough starter.
Yeah,
right?
that's what I was just thinking.
You always need a little bit there. For those of you, exactly, right? Like any of that kind of like, you got to have the mother in there with all the goodness. For those of you who cook or bake. Just to be clear though, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the green cone. So that's not intended to be that's like a different kind of anaerobic digestion chamber. So that's a very different biological system at process than the aerobic above ground sort of like compost bins or tumblers that we've been talking about otherwise.
Is it supposed to be quicker?
Sorry.
Is it supposed to be quicker?
It's not intended to actually get material out.
Okay.
And it's a lot of households in Vermont or even some small businesses have put them in because you can put dog or cat waste in them. You can put meat, bones, fat, basically stuff you don't want in your compost system, but you may still want to divert. You can put it there, but basically once it fills up, you're supposed to like cap it and move it to a new system. It takes a while to fill up. but it's really, it's a whole different use in my, I mean, it's a great tool to have, but it's a different tool in your tool belt. It's not exchangeable in my mind with an aerobic compost system.
And I have to add, I'm not really quite a fan right now of the green cone because I'm a backyard composter and windrows, and it was interesting to do the green cone, and I don't want to redirect all of this, but I'm not happy with those directions that came with the green cone and what it's supposed to do, because it's not doing what they say it's going to do, and the amount of time and energy it took to dig that hole in the ground to have that anaerobic digestion happening. It's very interesting. So anyways, another day.
Is that something you were asked to do? I know Vermonters requiring composting now statewide, I believe, correct?
Yeah, this is another grant that I'm working on, and so it was like, let's test out some other options, besides the basic earth machine or soil saver backyard composter. And so I was chosen to test out the green cone.
Okay, thank you.
And while you're correct about Vermont, we certainly don't mandate how you divert or how you compost. And it's not that everyone has to then personally compost. So there's all kinds of new haulers picking up residential. There's new compost facilities. So there's a whole, even there, like I was just saying, there's a whole suite of tools in that tool belt for Vermonters to choose what works best for them in terms of how to just, basically how to just not landfill your organic waste, but to put it to better use.
Yeah, makes sense.
Any other questions? I could talk forever about anything. So start me off in a direction and I'll keep going likely, but.
Natasha, I know one thing that's come up in a couple of the meetings before is the winter. And I know it was discussed in one of the videos, but I just wanted to bring it up and see, how do you handle the winter, and especially with a cold compost bin, where you might not get those temperatures and that allow it to, reduce 50% and start to really decompose. Can you add to it in the winter?
Absolutely. So you can, and again, it's a little bit of a geometry equation in terms of what is your volume and what is your space, because you're not going to get that full decomposition. If you're doing cold compost to begin with, you're not going to get like a 50% reduction at the same rate that you would in a hot compost system. Things just break down faster and reduce more in volume in a hot system. Cold composting, it's what I personally do at home. I have before, with a lot of management, kept my hot compost hot during the winter. But at a small volume, it takes a lot of management and care to keep it hot, because it's like, like with a larger volume, even if it's sort of freezing around the sides, as long as you have that right mix in the middle, it's still going to be heating up, and you can uncover a windrow of compost or a larger bin of compost in the dead of winter and have steam come pouring up, and it'll still be hot in there. But if you're just using like a small bin that you're composting in, and especially if you're not really aerating it, you're not turning it and mixing it, you're just layering and letting it go, you can do that all through the winter. That's totally fine. It will freeze and desiccate, so it'll dry out to some extent, as long as it's not being actively snowed in and some melting happening there. And so just that drying out will decrease the volume a little bit, but just keep on layering it. And then with the community sites that I work with that do cold composting, I really encourage and go and help them, what I call bring their system out of hibernation. So in the spring, or depending on what the year is like, when it starts warming up, this can happen a little bit as well if you get one of those January, oh my God, it's 70 degrees for a week and a half and then it freezes again. Things may get wet in a static system and be a little anaerobic and kind of icky and slimy and smelly, it's a great opportunity, even if it's on the rarest of occasions, once, maybe twice a year, even in a static system, to go ahead and, even if you just put a pitchfork in or an auger or something and break it up and add some extra carbon just to counter that sort of thawing moisture muck. It can be really helpful, just of the pleasantness of operating a system. But really, you're not gonna, as long as things are still frozen, you're not gonna have the smells because things are freezing. Still go ahead and layer that carbon though. I've also dealt with some sites that were like, everything's frozen, we don't need carbon anymore. And I'm not sure how those dots were connected, because at some point it is going to need that carbon to nitrogen ratio to, even in a cold compost system. And those sites, those systems can be really stinky come spring if you've been adding all of this, food scraps and no carbon at all. But yeah, you can just go ahead and keep doing the cold composting. Even if you're trying for a hot system, you need to have it be protected or insulated in some way, depending on what your system is and how large the volume is together. Otherwise, you may see that it's just not getting that hot if you don't have the volume, or if it's, like especially those tumblers, even the insulated ones, the Joras that are insulated, we've had really good luck. We've been using them at different sites in Vermont for 3 years now, so 3 winters. But if they're sited in an open area and it is whipping wind and we get ice storms and it is iced over, it is not going to stay hot. It is going to freeze in there. It'll thaw faster and it'll stay hot longer than an uninsulated system, but you're still going to run into problems under those extremes. But even just putting up some windbreaks or putting straw bales or hay bales around it to help with that, even if, so it's temporary, could help a lot during the winter.
I think that's why I really like the idea of having extra bins, if you can. For that winter time. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because, everyone's like, oh, I have this just one soil saver or earth machine or my pallet, and that's it. But it is really nice to have a second one. And I always wondered that when we were selling compost bins, how the sales increased every single year, because after a while it's like, didn't everybody already buy their compost bins? But people were finding that it's nice to have a second bin as an option for that. So if you're filling up, as Natasha said, that bin and you're just throwing your food waste in there, you do want to put your carbon in there too, which is going to take up more space. So it is good to have a second option to start filling up as well, especially in the wintertime. That's what I have found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unless you know that your bin is big enough that you're not going to run out of space. But having a second bin is great. And then if you do get into the situation where you want to bring your static compost bin out of hibernation, like I said, it's so much easier to have somewhere empty to turn it into. But not required. You can pull it out of there and put it right back in, but it's, it can just be a little bit easier in terms of management to have, to bring it over to a new bin.
Would one of you mind reviewing the process of cold compost versus hot compost? I only have the frame of reference of my husband's compost pile, which he's had for 35 years. And I'm gauging that it's a cold compost pile. He uses leaves to layer. But what temperature and what makes cold versus hot compost collection?
Do you want me to take this, or yeah? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So really the materials don't matter so much. It's more about management and making sure that you are having the carbon and the nitrogen, paying a little bit more attention to those ratios and sort of that recipe, and also the aeration and moisture. And then to some extent volume. It is much more challenging in a backyard, like in one of those soil savers, to have enough bulk to get the temperatures up. So when decomposers are, when the decomposition process is happening, one natural thing that happens is it creates heat as a side product from that process. And so hot composting is really, you're looking for temperatures at least at 120 degrees. 131 degrees is the point at which it's the process for further reducing pathogens. At 131 or hotter, you'll kill weed seeds. You can safely compost meat, bones will break down, all kinds of, you can put different and more materials into a hot compost because of those higher temperatures and that faster decomposition. Hot compost can get up to 170 degrees. I've seen them up as high as 190. That's getting too hot. That's actually starting to kill off some of those beneficial decomposers that you want. And so there you would want to, aerate, let out some of that steam, cool it down, look at your recipe, because it's running a little rich if you're getting temperatures of 170, 180. That is hot. But really, it just takes management. That's the biggest difference. So in a cold system, put your scraps in, layer it. Put your scraps in, layer it with carbon. You can, any kind of carbon. You can just kind of like, layer it and forget it, right? And as long as you're reasonably using carbon, enough carbon for your food scraps, it shouldn't really smell that much. It's not going to really, it's going to still decompose, but much slower. But if you're really tending it and you're mixing it to make sure that, you don't have pockets of, one thing that happens, I guess, in a cold compost system is you'll have a layer of food scraps and a layer of carbon, and it's sort of like a lasagna, right? And then what you're going to end up with is inevitably is pockets where it's food scraps without enough carbon next to it and carbon without enough food scraps next to it, right? So there's some distance between your carbon and nitrogen, especially from a tiny little microorganism point of view. And so the management part is like mixing, aerating, making sure you're getting that good combination of your ingredients, as well as limiting pockets of potentially over wet anaerobic with pockets that are too dry for the microorganisms to do it. So that's the management piece. I will say in the Jora compost tumblers, other tumblers as well, I just have more experience with Joras. I make no money by promoting them.
Okay, how do you spell that, Jora?
It's Jora.
Okay.
I like to say Yora.
And yeah, well, I checked, and it's actually named after the guy who invented it, and he pronounces his name Jora. But a lot of people will pronounce it Yora, so you're not alone. I kept doing it. I kept going back and forth, so I finally asked the guy, like, how do you pronounce this? So the larger ones, they're small, medium, and large, and the larger ones, you will get hot compost within 2 days. And part of that is just that tumbling action, right? So it makes that management piece of it easier. You put in your carbon or your food scraps and your carbon, and you just spin it and it tumbles. And like I have one now, and I walk by, and every time I walk by, regardless of what I'm doing, I just grab it and spin it, and just that action of that continual mixing, it helps address those aeration issues, the moisture issues, the carbon to nitrogen sort of combining, mixing issues. And really, to kill weed seeds in a tumbler, to kill, to do meat in a tumbler, you can get hot compost easily and keep temperatures in the 140s, 150s for 3-4 days going. And then move that contents to a bin, assuming you need more space in your tumbler to then process fresh scraps.
So there's, in the tumbler situation, I know my husband squirts down that area with a hose every now and then. Mm-hmm. He adds water to his compost pile.
Great.
And he also, uses a pitchfork and turns it over. So I'm trying to translate this into something that might be more workable with a school.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to add water if you have enough liquid in the food waste, is my impression. that
That's right. It depends a little bit on what you're adding. I mean, like, so some schools, if it's mostly carbohydrates that are dry, you might need to add water, right? But so it depends again on what is going into it. What are those feedstocks or that material that you're composting? If I've been, especially with some community gardens who do a bunch of canning, like their members will can tomatoes and then bring all that extra slop, and all of a sudden the system is like, whoa, you need extra dry stuff in there because you've just added 20 gallons of like tomato slop. So, it just depends on what you're putting in there. I always say, like, so in the tumblers as well, and I think we mentioned this in the videos, but I've seen people get the best and quickest results in terms of getting decomposition going in those tumblers in just a few days, with wood shavings or some kind of finer, high carbon material. Part of what you're doing there is you're saving volume in a smaller tumbler chamber for your food scraps, because you need less volume of a 500 part carbon to 1 part nitrogen than you would leaves, which is like 50 or 60 carbon to nitrogen. So you need less volume. So you're actually leaving space there. But the other thing with those curly wood shavings is that they have a lot of surface area. They blend right in really well, better than leaves might with those food scraps. So it just sort of is more conducive to getting those hot temperatures. I've seen one of our co-housing sites also has laying hens, and one died, and they put it in their tumbler, and there was like nothing left of that chicken after 10 days. I swear to you, maybe a stray bone. I mean, it was, and they were like, they told me what they had done. It was just before I came, and I was like, not sure I would have recommended that exactly. They just put it in and spun it, right? Like with the rest of the stuff. But it gone, right? So, and that's something you could absolutely bury a whole chicken in a static compost pile and it will break down. In fact, windrow composting is a best management practice for managing, like when we had the avian flu stuff and there were sick birds. But really, you want it at some point to get hot enough to kill any potential pathogens if you're composting, doing mortality composting is what it's called, or composting any significant amount of, animal product. I'm not at all concerned in a cold compost about a lasagna that has some meat in it or some casserole or some little bits, but I wouldn't, in a cold composter, especially in a school setting, I wouldn't necessarily recommend integrating whole animal carcasses.
Natasha, the drawer that you're talking about as the bigger one is the 400, right? Because the 275 probably can't do what you're saying.
Yes, it was the 400.
Yeah, so I'm just throwing that out there in case people don't know, like a large.
That's the large. That's the large size. And I'm happy to share specs. I don't have them up in front of me, but a large, I think it's like 100 and between the two chambers, it's like 120 or 140 gallon capacity. It's pretty big. I think
the 275 can handle 70 gallons.
Yeah.
Between those two chambers.
So it's a bit bigger. And it's used by, like at apartment buildings, food shelves, libraries, gardens, schools, co-housing places, neighborhoods. So, yep. Small businesses in Vermont a lot now are also using the tumbler.
So I think about the cold composting as like, I'm just going to compost and not pay much attention to it. I know I'm not going to add meat or dairy, right? I'm not going to mess with the recipe. And I think of the hot composting as I'm going to be a scientist and I'm really going to look at my ratios. I'm going to pay attention to my ingredients that I'm adding to the compost pile. I'm going to pay attention to the moisture. I'm going to get out there and, turn it around and get the air in there and get my pitchfork in there, whatever it may be. But that's how I look at hot composting. and cold composting, because composting happens regardless. And so the cold composting is more just like the lazy composter. Like you can still throw your stuff out there and then you see that it's going to be a muck. And then you're like, oh yeah, I got to add that sawdust or those leaves and get them in there. And I guess I got to pay attention to this. But that's how I always look at it. I look at the hot composting as being like the scientist in my composting, because I know I want to have that to use in a month, you know, or in half a month. I want it. I need to use it. I need to process it. I have a place to put it. And cold composting is like, I just don't want to throw away my food scraps. But I know if I throw them into my compost bin, eventually it's going to be compost, and I can put that on my garden, and I'm not throwing it into the landfill.
Yeah, you're talking about like cold compost is often a year process or sometimes more for it to be usable, stable, finished compost. Hot compost, I really wouldn't say, I mean, there's all kinds of things out there that like, finish compost in 2 weeks. That is not true. That will never be true. That is false advertising. But 6 to 8 weeks is pushing it. You really need to have your system honed. 3 to 4 months, absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why, you know, that's why I say the lazy composter, one season, you know, like let's just keep filling it up. And when the time comes and I'm thinking about my garden bed, my compost, I may have to cure it, you know, throw it off somewhere to cure. Maybe I'm going to take that compost and put it on my garden bed in the fall. So then it cures for the entire year, you know, before I start planting again in the spring. But the hot composting is definitely, I really need to use this more quickly.
Or even if you're not sure what you're going to do with it necessarily when it's done, it is a great educational opportunity for students who then get to take the temperatures, they get to try different recipes and ratios, and that's more the science lesson part. You will get that finished compost faster, but there a goal might be more around having students really learn like what is happening in there. I mean, you can even take, you know, different pieces and make a water, like a compost tea, and look at it at different stages. So not even finished compost, and look at it under a microscope and see what you can see and what's different between a cold system and a hot system, or a fresh system and an almost done system. Like there's all different kinds of curricula that you can weave in to a hot system that you just don't probably have the same breadth for a cold compost system. For an educational tool, it's still great. You can still learn all different kinds of lessons, but you're not seeing those spikes. You're not as easily within a semester able to measure reduction in volume, you know, from the decomposition process or whatever it is. So those are just some things to think about, but there's no one right or wrong way. Absolutely
right. Or like,
not.
what is it going to take to keep that temperature up to 130 for like 60 days? If you really want the hot compost system to go and kill those pathogens.
Are you going to tell us the answer to that?
No.
It's management. All comes down to management.
It's all just playing with it. You just play with your compost.
Are there any options for, you know, if you have a cold compost system and you can't put in the dairy, the excess milk, or, you know, the larger chunks of meat, are there options for what do you do with that? If you can't put it in your cold system. I mean, you can, and are there other diversion options that are, you know, accessible? Or would you have to, you could do a hauler for that
You
portion?
could do a hauler, depending on what it is. You could potentially partner with a farm, depending on what kind of animals they have and what kind of system they have. Or if you can divert to another compost site, whether that's a farm or, you know, so some farms have their own windrow composting or other composting systems that might be hot composting. So partnering with a farm like that, even if it's something that they don't want to feed directly to their animals, might be like, once composters really sort of get going, especially on a farm where you're thinking about, like, you want that finished compost to increase your soil health and your viability, right, as a farmer. So you realize that there is definitely value in scale, that there's a lot of value in more mass and, you know, having that larger volume in terms of keeping a hot composting system hot. And so maybe a farm that's taking pig slop, maybe they also compost and would be interested in taking some of those other organics that they could manage in their system, or diverting to a different commercial facility, if not an on-farm facility, is an option. Green cones are an option, although those come with some of their challenges, but that's what a lot of people pair cold composting and green cones with, for that, just the stuff that, you know, it's at least diverted. And I will just say, in the state of Vermont, even with our new law in place, if you are backyard composting your organics, you are still allowed to put meat and bones and dairy in the trash to be landfilled. Little known fact. And why that is they want people to feel safe about composting what they can in their backyard, and they don't want them to put materials in that might either attract animals or cause pathogen issues. And so that's this little loophole. But if you are in the state of Vermont, if you are having it hauled or diverted to a commercial site, you have to divert everything. If you're doing it at home, you divert what you safely can, and you can still landfill the rest. Not something that we'd like to think about. The other thing, or like to encourage, I guess I should say, the other thing that I would just say, Olivia, is to look at what the extra waste is that you can't compost, and is there a way of reducing the volume of that waste? So going back up then to the, you know, up the diversion hierarchy, and thinking, gosh, we can't put this milk in our cold compost system, but we seem to have so much of it all the time. There's so much unconsumed milk. What can we potentially do higher up the level, higher up that chain, to reduce some of that to begin with? So just to not forget that that's always your best option, is to reduce, even as a composter, right? There's always going to be stuff to compost, but really you want to be reducing food waste first, just in terms of responsibly managing our resources, right? It takes a lot of energy to make or grow, produce, truck, you know, all of that stuff. And so whatever we can be thinking about to reduce that volume to begin with will make whatever resulting compost system you have just easier to manage, because, you know, in many ways. One thing that I've seen some schools do, and then other, you know, some parents push back on, they were having a lot of wasted milk, and so they actually changed the size of their milk containers. So they went to a smaller milk container, because what they were having was not a bunch of unopened milk containers, but like half drank milk containers. And then some parents started pushing back about, oh, that's more packaging. Because now instead of buying, 100 pints, you're buying 200, however many half pints. But one, the question is, do you really need the same volume if you're already not drinking that much milk to begin with? So maybe you cut back on the volume, the individual packaging and the number of those, the actual count of those that you need in your school. But it's a trade-off, right? I mean, chances are you're going to be buying packaged milk if you're providing packaged milk, and then you just can think about what are other ways of reducing that waste. And one of the possibilities is smaller packaging of things. I don't know that that has to result in more packaged waste, but maybe in some cases it does.
A lot of schools too are trying to switch to the whole bulk, like milk dispenser, as well as a means to reduce that. So really that hierarchy goes reduction, which we know is like pre-consumer, really up that level of it. And then you have the food for people, and then you have your food for animals. Then it finally comes down to the composting, and then the landfilling or energy.
I do know, I have heard this year in particular that some schools are abandoning that bulk milk because of COVID issues and of needing to have it be distributed in classrooms. And so these are just unusual times. Like, right, normally we'd think, oh, this is a good direction to move in. And now a number of those schools that I know who have done that are like, who did we use to order that milk from? So, we just, there's a bunch of things that each community needs to balance and figure out what works best for them. And then there was also some concern with the smaller containers, maybe kids who did drink it enough, the whole thing weren't getting the same amount, or let them have 2 then, right? And it's just a balance of how, but having these conversations is so key. I guess that's one thing that I'll just circle back around to the communication piece, which anyone who knows me knows that's I get that in everywhere I can, right? Talk to your students, your parents, the people who are ordering your food, your cafeteria staff, your facility, like however many people, however bigger that conversation can be, chances are you'll come up with more options than maybe you could, certainly than I could by myself, I'll just say, because you just get the diversity of ideas, that sort of synergy of what happens when you're brainstorming with partners as opposed to just sort of on your own. And then as well, there may be issues that you didn't even consider, whether they end up being like, oh, let's explain this. It doesn't have to be more packaging, or if a kid really wants 2 milks, they can have 2 small milks instead of 1 big one. Or there might be some real issues or concerns that you hadn't thought of about your planned action forward. And so just keeping those communications open and thinking about your stakeholders broadly, I think really lends to the richness and also to the success.
Or they just can't leave the table until they finish and clean their plate. The Clean Plate Club. No, but that's another one too. If we're talking about reduction, is trayless, right? Or smaller plates. But again, with schools, it's a little bit more difficult because I guess there are some quantities that the students need to eat due to the nutritious guidelines. But if you even think about that, like a lot of times schools have reduced, I'm thinking universities more than elementary schools, they've been able to reduce by saying today is a trayless day. No trays. You just have your plate, you get what can fit on your plate, and if you want more, then you're gonna go back for more. Same thing like you were just saying with the milk, like we have this milk, if you want more than that, then you can have the option to go back. Or smaller plates. Because people have a tendency, if you have a big plate or a big tray, it's, you just fill it up like buffets. You fill it up and then you're not eating it all. And then you have to figure out how to throw it away or compost it.
I'm curious, are there any, and I think Natasha, Cindy, and maybe even Jen, are there any specific challenges or joys with composting, especially at the younger elementary grades? I feel like that, in my mind, like I think, if you don't have a 7th grade, who's going to carry out the big bucket? It's a different setup, right? When they're so young. And so I was just curious if there were any insights from experiences working with those younger students.
So typically for when I was doing it with the cold system, but it was out in the garden, it's 5th grade, because 5th grade, the curriculum in New Hampshire is soil science. So it's a very big leap to just do composting because you're doing soil science anyway. And some of those kids, my 5th grader last year was 5'6", so some of those 5th graders are fairly large. So that's typically what we did, is we would put them in charge of that.
Yeah, in Vermont, there are a lot of 4th and 5th graders. And I think, again, for the curriculum. And then, then of course there's high school and, middle schools have programs too, but it's very common. For the younger grades, I've seen worm composting in the classrooms. And then I've also seen younger, like even like kindergarten, first, second graders, just have smaller pails and have more kids carrying them. So, so there's ways around that in terms of like the physical strength of it. And I think then as well, you know, you may want for the younger, trying to think, like for most of the programs that I've worked with younger kids, they have more adults engaged, you know, whether it's a parent or a community volunteer or more teachers, because there are things that kids, depending on your system, that kids just that little may not physically be able to like pitchfork, you know, a bunch of compost from one bin to another or turn a big tumbler or what, you know, so you may just need a little bit more adult oomph behind systems wherever that might come from. It kind of varies. And I just think it's the, you know, I think it's never too early. So
I've noticed the young kids love the gross factor of it. So that's always a nice way to pull them in. They love all the little microorganisms and they really do love the gross factor. And they can do that. As Natasha said, you just give them little pails to deal with and they catch on. From kindergarten to third graders are still very able to do this. You know, they may not understand the whole science of it, but you can at least get them to understand the greens, your nitrogen, your browns. And let's just go with color and figure that out. They may not understand the whole math aspect of it, but you can get them to understand chopping it will make it go quicker, whether it's a green or a brown. And like I said, they do understand how things decay and they do love the critters that are in the compost pile.
Yep. Yep. Or letting them feel the heat of a hot compost pile as opposed to, you know, you have to take a temperature and write it down, you know, like it. So it's a presented slightly different. I do think that you get to a funny age where the ick factor then becomes a real turnoff for some kids. And then you just sort of have to navigate around that. But I think part of it is establishing the culture of composting, and then it's, you know, it is what it is, and you do it like you do other things. But there's definitely, in my mind, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think one of my nieces was maybe 10, and she had been helping me with my compost when she would come and stay with us at like forever, right? Like her whole life. And then all of a sudden it was the grossest thing in the entire world that she had ever seen. And it was this huge hardship to have her go take the food scrap pail out to my compost system. You know, she got over it.
It happens in middle school, because I noticed that with waste audits, you know, like kids love to dive into waste audits when they're in elementary school up to about 6th grade. And then 7th and 8th, they get a little too conscious of like having to be cool and clean and whatever. And so they stand back a little bit more, and it's harder to get them involved with that.
Yeah,
that's what I've
So
noticed.
I do let them trade who will go out. And last year it ended up that it was David. It was David's job. That's what he did. And he would trade jobs, classroom jobs, with anyone else. And he just wanted to go. It was his compost bin. So I'm actually going to have to talk to him about his compost bin before I get started this year, because I think he does feel some ownership for it.
Yeah. But you know, that's where you want to get to, right? That's great. As long as there is some space for other kids who might be interested to help out and pitch in. But yeah, I think that's super. Yeah.
It's like any team, you have to work on everybody's strengths to make it happen.
Well, and you know, there's also like so many different ways. It could be that maybe, you know, a kid is really artistic and wants to draw all of the picture, you know, the signs that go up for the collection pails or whatever. I mean, it's kids or adults. It's really the same conversation that I have with my adult community composting sites, where some people don't want to get dirty. Some people, you know, it's a little too ick for them to manage, but they can, you know, draw signs or help with writing up stuff, or they'll be the ones with I actually see this at schools a lot for ones where they're actually keeping track of the volume. Someone will be there with the clipboard and their log, and they're the scribe, right? While the other kids are doing, you know, whatever it is that they are doing, whatever other jobs. So there's a place for everybody, really.
I think we've been slowly trickling down, but I know
Yeah.
Maureen had a question.
Actually, I wanted to say that I knew the time was coming to an end. I wanted to compliment you on, first of all, the sequence of videos was excellent. And secondly, this format of just talking and hearing other people's experience, I think is just very rewarding. And the enthusiasm factor is quite high right now.
Great.
I thought it was great.
Thanks, Maureen. I appreciate it. Glad it's helpful.